In the summer heat of August 1944, somewhere in the fields and villages of western France, the German High Command was looking at their maps with a kind of quiet confidence that history would soon prove tragically misplaced. According to their intelligence reports, the American army was nothing to fear. They had red assessments claiming American soldiers were soft, comfortable, maybe even a little lazy, too dependent on their fancy equipment and machines to really understand the brutal reality of war. The German generals, veterans of campaigns across Europe, genuinely believed that after the grinding battles in Normandy, the Americans were spent, exhausted, practically begging for a chance to catch their breath. They thought stopping this army would be straightforward, maybe even easy. But if those same generals had bothered to listen more carefully to their own pilots, the ones actually flying reconnaissance missions over French roads near Avranches, they might have reconsidered their comfortable assumptions. Those Luftwaffe pilots were coming back with reports that painted a very different picture. They described long convoys stretching for miles, thousands upon thousands of trucks moving in organized columns, and hundreds of tanks rolling forward with a kind of mechanical determination that was frankly unsettling. When these reports reached headquarters, the reaction was almost dismissive, accompanied by knowing chuckles and confident predictions. "The Americans are slow," they said. "They are heavy and cumbersome. We will strike them hard and watch them crumble like a house of cards." But down on the ground, where the actual fighting was about to unfold, reality was preparing to deliver a lesson that German doctrine had never anticipated. The U.S. 4th Armored Division, commanded by General John S. Wood, was advancing across the French countryside with a precision and speed that seemed almost impossible for an army supposedly exhausted from weeks of combat. This was not the slow, grinding advance the Germans expected. This was something else entirely, something that embodied the classic American approach to warfare that would define the rest of the campaign. Mobility became the watchword. Rapid maneuvers replaced static defensive thinking. Constant, relentless pressure on the enemy gave them no time to breathe, no time to regroup, no time to think. Veterans who survived those August days still remember, decades later, the discipline and decisiveness that characterized these American units. Junior officers and enlisted men alike acted on their own initiative, refusing to wait for orders from above when they saw an opportunity. They kept moving forward, always forward, with a kind of restless energy that wore down even the most determined opposition. Facing this American juggernaut were what remained of Germany's elite formations, units that had once struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. The Panzerlehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's best trained and most prestigious armored divisions, was there, although by August 1944 it was a shadow of its former glory. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division were also in the area, still considered formidable despite being worn down by months of continuous combat. These were not inexperienced troops. These were veterans who had fought across multiple theaters, who understood warfare at a level that came only from surviving battles that killed most of their comrades. But there was a gap, a massive gulf really, between what the Germans expected from their American opponents and what those Americans were actually capable of delivering. The American columns moved across France not like some disorganized mob, not like an exhausted army just trying to survive, but like a precisely calibrated, high-speed machine that had been designed for exactly this kind of warfare. Behind this capability was a logistical system that the Germans simply could not match at this stage of the war. New supply methods kept ammunition and fuel flowing to the front lines. Powerful tow vehicles could move disabled tanks quickly. Mobile repair units worked around the clock, often fixing damaged vehicles right behind the advancing spearheads. And perhaps most importantly, American junior officers had the authority and the confidence to make decisions on their own, to seize opportunities without waiting for permission from headquarters miles away. This combination of factors gave the Americans a decisive advantage that German commanders were only beginning to understand. The lessons from the brutal July and August battles in Normandy were becoming crystal clear. Speed could replace armor thickness. Initiative and quick decision-making could overcome years of combat experience. When German forces prepared their defenses expecting a standard American attack, the kind they thought they understood, the 4th Armored Division was already halfway through a flanking maneuver that German headquarters had not anticipated, had not planned for, and could not effectively counter. Within the next 48 hours, everything would change. A captured German officer, speaking to American interrogators after the battle, summed up the situation with brutal honesty. "We thought we understood the Americans," he admitted. "We were completely wrong." The morning of August 27th arrived with beautiful weather, the kind of clear summer day that seemed inappropriate for the violence about to unfold. Forward units of Panzerlehr, dug into positions they considered reasonably strong, expected the battle to follow a familiar pattern. First would come the artillery barrage, hours of shelling designed to soften up defenses. Then a slow infantry advance, cautious and methodical. Finally, the tanks would appear, moving forward to exploit whatever gaps the infantry had created. This pattern had been typical in Sicily, in Italy, and in the early weeks of fighting in Normandy. The Germans had seen it so many times they could practically set their watches by it. Instead, they heard something completely different, a sound that sent a chill down the spine of every experienced soldier who recognized what it meant. There was a continuous roar of engines, not distant but close, getting closer. Rapid flanking movements began hitting positions from unexpected directions. American reconnaissance units engaged German forward positions but refused to commit fully, dancing back whenever the Germans tried to concentrate their fire, forcing defensive positions to reveal themselves without actually taking casualties. Within minutes, not hours, the main American strike hit with devastating effect. Veterans of that battle still call it a textbook example of decisive maneuver warfare, the kind of operation that gets studied in military academies for generations. Rather than attacking German positions directly, which would have been costly and slow, American Sherman tanks and lighter reconnaissance vehicles moved in wide arcs around the enemy, exploiting weak flanks where German anti-tank defenses were thinnest and fuel shortages had made repositioning nearly impossible. German radio communications, monitored by American signals intelligence, erupted with panic and confusion. Panzer commanders were sending increasingly desperate messages, reporting unexpected flanking attacks, rapid American movements that they described as impossible, tactics that their entire doctrine had no answer for. This was more than just a tactical defeat. This was a blow to German professional pride, to the carefully cultivated image of Wehrmacht superiority. Panzerlehr had been an elite formation, fully motorized at a time when much of the German army still relied on horses, crewed by highly trained soldiers who had survived battles that killed most of their generation. By August 1944, however, it had become a shell of its former strength, bombed relentlessly by Allied aircraft, worn down by continuous combat, and critically short of the fuel that its tanks and vehicles desperately needed. The Americans sensed this weakness like predators sensing wounded prey. Every intersection they captured, every German supply truck they destroyed, every bridge they secured before it could be blown open new options for maneuver, new routes of advance that the Germans could not predict or counter. By midday, German unit commanders were beginning to realize with growing horror that the battle was not unfolding according to any plan they recognized. A captured officer, interviewed after his surrender, tried to explain what they had experienced. "We expected a slow frontal advance," he said, still seeming somewhat dazed by what had happened. "Instead, we faced something like a lightning strike, fast and devastating. But as shocking as the morning assault had been, it was only the beginning. The most humiliating moments for these German elite units, moments that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives, would come by evening." By the evening of August 27th, German headquarters was struggling desperately to make sense of a battlefield that seemed to be dissolving into chaos. Telephone lines were overloaded with panicked reports. Radio communications were intermittent, disrupted by American jamming and by the simple fact that many German units were moving too quickly, either advancing or retreating, to maintain steady contact with command. The reports that did get through were fragmented, often contradictory, filled with contradictions and impossible claims, but the overall picture they painted was unmistakably clear. The Americans were advancing far too fast. German officers, trained in a system that prized careful analysis and methodical planning, could not assess the constantly shifting battlefield quickly enough to make effective decisions. In the afternoon hours, the 4th Armored Division executed a maneuver that would later be described in military history books as a textbook example of mobile warfare done right. Rather than storming fortified panzer positions head-on, accepting heavy casualties for limited gains, American tanks and mechanized infantry struck hard at the left flank of German positions, hitting a seam in the defenses that intelligence had identified but that German commanders had not adequately reinforced. The German reaction was delayed, fatally delayed. Soldiers of the 2nd Panzer Division, exhausted from weeks of combat and poorly supplied due to constant Allied air attacks on supply lines, tried frantically to establish an improvised defensive line at an important crossroads. By the time they reached the position, American forces were already there. Having moved faster than German doctrine had anticipated was even possible for such a large force. The main reason for German shock and dismay was the fundamental nature of the warfare they were experiencing. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had been their trademark, their gift to military history, the tactical innovation that had conquered most of Europe in a matter of months. Now, in the summer of 1944, they were watching Americans conduct a lightning offensive in what seemed like the German way, except it was faster, more flexible, and backed by resources that Germany could no longer match. A particularly dramatic episode occurred at a small village called Tessy-sur-Vire. German intelligence reports had indicated the village was defended by a single infantry company and a few anti-tank gun positions, nothing that should slow down a determined attack for more than a few hours. The Americans did not even bother with a direct assault. They bypassed the strongest defensive points entirely, flanking the village from 2 directions simultaneously and neutralizing all significant resistance within 20 minutes of the first shot being fired. By late evening, German generals back at their headquarters, trying to manage multiple crises simultaneously, realized with growing dread the true severity of their situation. Panzer Lehr was losing combat-effective units rapidly, its strength bleeding away with every passing hour. The 2nd Panzer Division reported that it could not move its remaining tanks into defensive positions because it simply did not have enough fuel, and none was coming. American forces were exploiting every advantage they possessed with ruthless efficiency. Supply columns kept pace with the advancing tanks, sometimes moving faster than the combat units themselves. Engineers cleared roads of obstacles almost as quickly as they appeared. Repair teams worked around the clock under improvised lighting, getting damaged vehicles back into the fight within hours instead of days. General John Wood, the aggressive and innovative commander of the 4th Armored Division, was applying principles of breakthrough and exploitation in real time, in actual combat conditions, with a flexibility that left German forces always one step behind, always reacting to moves that had already happened rather than anticipating what would come next. Prisoners captured that night, huddled under guard in hastily organized collection points, were exhausted physically and emotionally, many of them still in a state of disbelief about what they had just experienced. One officer, a veteran of campaigns in Russia and North Africa, admitted with obvious pain that his men had never understood where the Americans were coming from. "You moved faster than we could even report your movements," he said. "How do you fight an enemy you cannot track?" The psychological impact of this defeat was proving as decisive as the tactical one. German troops, who had been told repeatedly that they were members of superior formations, were watching their elite units fall apart, not for lack of courage or fighting spirit, but simply because they could not keep up with the tempo of American operations. By midnight, as exhausted soldiers on both sides tried to grab a few hours of sleep, the 4th Armored Division had broken completely through 2 prepared German defensive lines, rendering weeks of careful German planning completely obsolete. The final blow to German hopes would come with the sunrise. The morning of August 28th revealed a reality to German headquarters that no amount of propaganda or wishful thinking could disguise. Intelligence reports now included a word that was rare in Wehrmacht communications, a word that represented the ultimate military failure. Überraschung, complete surprise. The Americans began the day with a maneuver that would later be studied in military academies as a classic example of how to exploit an enemy's limited retreat options. The 4th Armored Division moved to cut a key road that was being used by both Panzer Lehr and the 2nd Panzer Division for their planned withdrawal to new defensive positions. 4 German commanders trying to salvage something from the disaster. This move was absolutely catastrophic, the equivalent of losing control of an entire front. Elite mechanized units, the pride of the German army, suddenly found themselves partially trapped in a shrinking pocket with limited options for escape. American artillery fire, precise and overwhelming in its volume, prevented German units from regrouping effectively. American tanks occupied the high ground overlooking key crossroads and withdrawal routes, able to fire down on any German vehicle that tried to move through those critical choke points. The most dramatic moment of the entire 2-day battle occurred at a location called Argentan-Pont. The remaining operational German tanks, perhaps 36 vehicles from both divisions combined, attempted a coordinated breakout, a desperate bid to punch through American lines and escape encirclement. The Americans were ready, almost as if they had predicted exactly what the Germans would try. Sherman tanks advanced in groups of 3, mutually supporting each other with overlapping fields of fire, a tactic that American crews had refined through hard experience in Normandy. Mechanized infantry units flanked the German tank crews from forest edges, using bazookas and rifle grenades to target the vulnerable sides and rear armor of German vehicles. The entire German assault collapsed within 40 minutes, leaving the battlefield littered with burning vehicles and surrendering crews. By midday, American forces were counting dozens of abandoned German vehicles, many of them left behind simply because there was no fuel to drive them, and hundreds of German prisoners being marched to the rear. A panzer officer, interviewed in captivity while still wearing his dusty uniform, admitted something that must have been deeply painful for a professional soldier to say. "Your tanks did not stop moving," he explained. "We expected pauses, rest periods, time to reorganize after each phase of the battle. There were none. You just kept coming." By afternoon, German command was desperately trying to organize any kind of orderly retreat that might save what remained of two once proud divisions. Every potential withdrawal route they identified seemed to be blocked already. American reconnaissance units were moving so quickly, penetrating so deeply into what should have been German rear areas, that captured prisoners later said with obvious frustration that American forces appeared in positions before German commanders could even predict where they might be heading. By the evening of August 28th, just 48 hours after the battle had begun, both elite German divisions had effectively ceased to exist as organized, combat-effective military units. Panzer Lehr had lost the vast majority of its remaining vehicles and combat personnel. The 2nd Panzer Division had fragmented into dozens of small groups, each trying independently to escape encirclement and reach German lines, many of them destined to be captured in the following days. The Americans, in sharp contrast to their disorganized opponents, advanced confidently and professionally, their supply lines functioning smoothly, their communications working, their morale sky high. The 4th Armored Division had accomplished something that German headquarters had deemed literally impossible just days before. Within 48 hours of intensive combat, it had completely defeated two elite German armored formations that represented the best troops Germany could still field, outpacing them strategically in planning and operational art, outmaneuvering them tactically on the battlefield, and breaking them psychologically through relentless pressure that gave them no chance to recover. A captured German officer, a major who had commanded a tank battalion that no longer existed, told Allied interrogators something that captured the entire experience perfectly. "We thought Americans were slow and methodical," he said quietly. "We thought you could not advance without long pauses to consolidate and resupply, but you achieved what we accomplished in France in 1940, the great victories we remember. Only you did it faster and more completely." This operation, relatively small in the context of the entire war, but perfect in its execution, became an early and striking example of a fundamental shift in military capability. The United States Army had mastered mobile warfare, the kind of fast-moving, decisive operations that Germany had pioneered, and in many ways the Americans were now executing these operations better than the German forces once considered unbeatable. For American veterans who survived the war and lived to tell their stories to children and grandchildren, this victory in the French countryside remains a powerful testament to courage under fire, discipline in chaos, and the initiative shown by soldiers at every level who refused to wait for orders when they saw what needed to be done. For German commanders who survived the war and tried to make sense of their defeat, it was a lesson learned at terrible cost, a demonstration that superiority in warfare comes not just from courage or training, but from logistics, flexibility, and the ability to make decisions faster than your enemy can react.